very much for that. And yeah, morning everybody. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see so many people turned out on what's a Sunday morning, and you could be doing gardening at home. So yeah, my name's Clive, and I'm involved with a group called Climate Change Gardening. So at the back there's also another trustee. So yeah, we've got 45 minutes, and so we are going to be covering. We'll probably have a bit of a quiz at some stage, maybe a little survey. We'll talk about the climate, obviously. Wildlife will come into it, flowers will, vegetables, if you like vegetables. And so we're going to be touching on a number of things. Quiz, yeah, questionnaire at the end, if you like questionnaires. We love ticking boxes, don't we? So we've got one of those to look forward to. And so that's what we're doing. We won't be covering, it's only 45 minutes or so. I might overrun by a few minutes. Hopefully you're not in a rush to get away. But we won't be covering everything. You know, sometimes I do these talks, people say, oh, you didn't mention this thing about bird boxes or whatever it is. Well, you know, we can't cover everything, but we'll cover what we can. So that's what we've got, a bit of a sort of magazine approach, sort of, I won't say lightweight, but we'll sort of romp through it here on a Saturday morning. Yeah, do come in. Plenty of seats. So yeah, make yourself comfortable there. Climate change. There it is. You know, pretty much most days we put the news on, don't we, on the TV or the radio or whatever, and climate change comes up. There's another flood. There's another fire, normally in a country a long way away. And so that's it. We've sort of got used to it, haven't we? Really. But on a personal level, you know, you individually, are you worried about climate change? You know, or is it one of those things that you feel, you know what, I've got enough resources and resilience to see myself through it? You know, it's a shame about those people in underdeveloped or less developed countries, but are you worried about, put your hands up if you're worried about climate change yourself. Yeah, well, most people, almost everybody, I think, put their hands up. And so that's good, but you're a kind of self-selecting group, aren't you, really? You've come here to listen to a thing about climate change, so I'm not surprised that most of you, and I'm not going to add up the numbers and do the maths because I can't talk and do maths at the same time, but you know, 90% of you are worried about climate change. But if you think of Cambridge as a whole, or even Cambridgeshire as a whole, if you think of all those people down where you live, down your street, those people where you work, the people you see in the supermarket or whatever, how many of those do you think are worried about climate change the same as you are? Would you think, you know, I'll give you some numbers. Do you think it's from somewhere between 0 and 25%? Put your hands up if you think no more than 25% of people are worried about climate change. So you all think it's more than 25%? Okay, that's great. What about well, put your hands up if you think it's somewhere between 25%, let's move it up a bit, from 25 to 50% of the people you see around you. Put your hands up if you think it's in that category. 25 to 50% of people around Cambridgeshire that you come across, and that's almost all the hands have gone up. Anybody think that more than 50% of people as a whole are worried about climate change? So one hand's gone up. Okay, that's very interesting. Look, I'm going to give you the official figure. Well, I say official. I'll give you some figures here. So are we worried about climate change? The Office for National Statistics here in the UK say that 74% of adults are very or somewhat concerned about climate change. You came up with a bigger number. I think it was like 90% or so. And but then you're a self-selecting climate change orientated audience. I'm not surprised that you were above 74%. Now, here's the interesting thing. There's a study that came out this year. It's got a sort of snappy title of Globally Representative Evidence of the Action of Climate Change. But what they're saying is there is, on average, and they looked at a lot of countries, on average, there's a 26% gap between the actual proportion of people who are willing to participate or concerned about climate action, 70%, and the average perceived proportion. But what they're saying is that people who are worried about climate change underestimate the number of other people that are also worried about climate change. And you've done exactly the same. You've fitted into that pattern. You've said, almost most of you said, I don't think more than 50% of people are worried about climate change. Actually, according to the Office for National Statistics, the figure is 74%. So you underestimated the number of people worried about climate change by, if we said 50% max, you underestimated it by 24%. Actually, the figure from this snappy little paper here by Peter Andre et al. Is 26%. So you actually, I know this is just made up maths in my head, but you get what I'm saying. We tend to underestimate the number of people concerned about climate change. And the important thing about that is, you know, we sometimes find ourselves in a situation where you think, oh, I don't know if I should mention climate change. You know, these folk around me, I don't know, at the school gate or, you know, friends, or we've gone out somewhere in the pub or whatever it is. I don't know if we should mention climate change because it's a bit of a, the chances are the person sitting next to you, the person at the school gates, the person wherever it is also just as worried about climate change. They're more likely to be worried about it, more likely to be worried about climate change than not worried. So the message is kind of speak up for climate change, and you know, you're not alone. The majority of people, 74% of people, according to the National Office for National Statistics, 74% of people in the UK are worried about climate change. Don't underestimate other people's beliefs. So let's move on. We're getting away from gardening, but I just thought we'd do that, have a little experiment. So climate change, there it is. I'm not going to go into about carbon dioxide and the rest of that, but how is it affecting our gardens? How would we find out where to get information about what's happening to our gardens? Well, arguably, the best report is this one, Gardening in a Changing Climate. You can download this online. It's published by the Royal Horticultural Society, published in 2017, 87 pages of it. So it's quite a serious read, you know, for those who, you know, read Gardening Weekly magazine. This is a kind of a change of gear. 87 pages of it. Fortunately, chapter 7 looks at east of England where we are. So if you wanted to come to the sort of the nub of it, you go to chapter 7. But there that is. And so it's very, very thorough, very detailed, very scientific. It's interesting. It's published in 2017. Now, you might think 2017 isn't that long ago. It was published in 2017. It's, let's say, written in 2016. It's based on evidence from, you know, 2010, 2011, 2012, that sort of time. And then it starts to feel like quite a long time ago. If you read that, it almost feels out, you know, out of step with what's happening now. It doesn't refer to the situation that we had only 2 years ago in Cambridgeshire, or Cambridge, or whatever it was. The botanical gardens hit 40 degrees, and, you know, we were told to stay indoors. So it's probably the best we've got. But the climate change situation, climate change itself, is changing. You know, it's accelerating, as we hear again so often on the news, depending on what we read. So 2017 already feels a bit out of date. But anyway, what are they saying about our gardens? They're saying that there will be overall a gradual increase in average temperatures in all seasons. And, you know, we know that. We used to call it global warming, didn't we? But we've changed the sort of nuance on that a little bit to climate change. But we're going to see average temperatures increase in all seasons. If you've got a lawn and you cut it, you're going to be starting to cut your lawn earlier in the year and continue to do so later into the autumn. Flowers will flower earlier. There's another study by folk here at the university which found that they looked at a very broad range of flowers in the UK with data going back for many, many years, and they're finding that on average now flowers are flowering a month earlier than they were in the 1980s. You know, the daffodils flower earlier, the crocuses flower earlier, and so on. So we've got a longer growing season. We've got flowers flowering earlier, and that earlier thing can be disruptive to wildlife. You know, some of the insects are geared to waking up out of hibernation, expecting to find certain flowers in bloom, but now they wake up out of hibernation and the flowers bloomed and died and gone, and they've sort of missed the slot that they had. So slowly increasing temperatures. The summers are going to become drier and hotter. The rain that we do get in the summer is likely to come in heavy bursts. So there'll be a drought followed by a really wet period, followed by a drought, followed by a really wet period. I know every year is different, but that'll be the trend. And in the winter, we're going to get milder, wetter winters, like we did this winter, you know, this year, the last winter. You know, I don't think we had any snow in Cambridge, and certainly had plenty of rain, didn't we? We were rained out from sort of November through to April, May, or June. The garden was waterlogged. So we're going to get these milder, wet winters, but superimposed on these gradual trends, we've also got more variability. We are going to get late frosts in the spring that take the flowers off the fruit trees. We are going to get sudden cold snaps early in the winter when the flowers and the plants aren't properly prepared for winter, and we're going to lose plants at that time, and the heavy rain leading to waterlogging and flooding. So that's a sort of summary. If you want to look into it in detail, of course, go and download that document from the website. So the question is, you know, as gardeners, how do we respond to this? You know, what should we do? I belong to, I don't know if you know West Wickham. It's a little village in South Cambridgeshire, the other side of Linton. If you went out on the road there at the top, Hills Road, and carried on driving along, you come to Linton. West Wickham's the other side of that. They've got a gardening club, and I'm a member of it. Sue at the back there runs it. And we started to talk about climate change a couple of years ago, found ourselves, you know, thinking, well, what should we do? And we teamed up with some other gardening clubs, and we organised an event, various things happened. But we came down to, if you like, establishing 4 ways of thinking about climate change as gardeners. One of the ways is to say, climate change is coming. I wish it wasn't, but we're just going to have to accept it. You know, if I want to grow flowers, I'm going to have to water them more, and you know, and so on and so forth. We've got to live with it somehow. It's a bit of a shrug of the shoulders, and that's not to say it's a bad thing. You know, that's what many people are going to do, and that's okay. The second option, perhaps, is to say, I want to do a little bit more than just adapt to it. I want to soften the impact of it. I know some of the damage that climate change is doing to the environment. I know it's, for example, drying up all the ponds in the broader landscape outside of town. So perhaps I'll get myself a pond, and that will soften the impact of it to some extent, a bit of sort of compensatory action. Or we could say, well, look, I actually want to tackle climate change itself. I've got this, the average garden is 188 square meters, apparently. I've got my 188 square meters on average. What can I do in my garden that will reduce carbon dioxide emissions? I've got a petrol lawnmower. Perhaps when it next breaks down, I'll ditch it, get an electric lawnmower, or maybe even stop mowing the lawn altogether and let the grass grow long. So we could reduce our emissions, or we could say, you know, if we're of a more sort of confrontationary mindset, we can say, what can we do to actually pull carbon dioxide out the air? You know, even if we stop emitting it, the planet has still got more carbon dioxide in the air than it should do. We need to somehow carbon capture, pull that out the air. And so those are the options. And really what I'm going to do now, I thought, is just to run through some of those with you, just to touch on each one, look at some of the options, see what you do, see what's out there. Accept and adapt then. Back to number 1, accept and adapt. This is climate change is coming, it's a bit of a nuisance. What can I do in my garden? Because I like my garden. How can I still manage? Well, a few years ago, everybody was talking about drought tolerant planting. You know, I think we thought everything was just going to dry up. That was the way it's going to go. People thought, oh, you know, I've been to the south of France or Spain or the Canary Islands or something. It's going to be a bit like that. That's what we need to do from now on. And that's fine. You know, you can have a drought tolerant garden. You know, put in free draining gravel, put in those Mediterranean type plants with their silvery leaves, you know, reflective foliage, so that the leaves don't get too hot, and they've got these, you know, ways of reducing evaporation of water from the leaves and so on. So there's those Mediterranean style plants that you can plant if you wanted to see a garden like that. Cambridge Botanical Garden, you know, you could more or less walk there from here, I dare say, and that's a lovely garden, and that apparently has never been watered. I don't know how long it's been there, several decades. It's never been watered, but it still looks nice, and it's very, you know, applicable to the normal residential 188 square metre back garden. If you wanted something a bit more adventurous, Beth Chatto down there, Colchester, she was one of the sort of grandmothers of sort of environmental planting, and she had a dry garden, and it's great to go and see it. RHS, the Royal Horticultural Society, Hyde Hall, have got a very nice dry garden. It's a big, ambitious garden. It doesn't sort of translate into what you might do in your back garden, but it's interesting to see it nonetheless. So that's part of accepting it. Say, climate change is coming. you know, the normal plants aren't going to do so well anymore with those hot, dry spells in the summer. Perhaps I'll go down drought-tolerant planting. And the Royal Horticultural Society will have some nice lists on their website of plants that will do well in that situation. There's now, moving on from the Mediterranean style of stuff after last winter, and to some extent before, depending on where you live in the country, we've realised that climate change is not only bringing Mediterranean weather, it's bringing prolonged wet spells when our garden is going to get maybe flooded, if you've got that sort of garden. Certainly it's going to get waterlogged. Our garden, we live 15 miles down the road there just into Suffolk, and our garden was completely waterlogged. It wasn't flooded, but it's completely waterlogged really from, you know, Christmas, pre-Christmas, through to probably May, I'm going to say, before eventually it sort of dried up and you could start to do stuff there again. So, you know, this was perhaps what people thought we had to do. Now people are saying, oh, actually, raised beds are more appropriate because we can lift the plants out of that surface water and we can maintain reasonable planting despite that. And that's fine. Raised beds do need watering, so even if you've got raised beds to lift the plants out of the water in the winter or the spring, you're still going to get hot, dry spells in the summer, so you're going to need a lot of water. So the view now is that we should be capturing and using as much rainwater as we can. You know, if you want to grow vegetables, it's okay having a drought-tolerant garden for the flowers, but if you want to grow vegetables to eat, you know, and fruit and so on, come to that, you're going to need to put them in, you know, decent soil, and that's going to need watering through these long drought periods in the summer. So the view now on watering is, well, we shouldn't be using tap water, certainly not for the garden, certainly not here at Cambridge, you know, because there's such a pressure on tap water supplies, as you know, about the, you know, debates about new housing, and you'll have seen the thing about the, is it 9 wells or 7 wells over by Addenbrooke's has dried up because of so much abstraction by the water companies in order to provide water for people's houses and gardens. So the more that we can collect our own rainwater and use that on the garden, the more we're taking pressure off of the main supply. We're keeping those chalk streams, those Cambridgeshire chalk streams flowing, and also it enables us to keep our vegetables and fruit and so on growing, which obviously we're not going to do in a Mediterranean style garden. So accept and adapt there. There's things we can do there that will enable us to keep gardening. Either we go the Mediterranean route or we have raised beds, but with lots of additional water that we've collected off the roof and stored, because your normal 200-litre rain bucket is probably going to get emptied, you know, in a week or two of dry weather. But moving on from that, so accept and adapt. We've dealt with that one slide. Moving on to softening the impact. You know, we know that climate change is going to bring a variety of problems. Let's see if we can use our garden to sort of solve those for us. And one of them, you know, in some ways it's kind of obvious, is using shade. You know, we all know about shade. Our dog knows about shade. In hot weather, she goes and lies in the shade. You know, it's not rocket science. The dog's worked it out for herself. Which, with, you know, more research into climate science, we're realizing much more the importance of shade as a way of mitigating the impact of local climate change. The shade under the plants, in this case, it's like a sort of grapevine, but shade under trees and so on as well. You know, tree-lined streets can be 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees cooler than a non-tree-lined street during hot weather. You know, it's like a massive outdoor air conditioning system, and it's noticeable not just in the street, but in the houses lining the street. You know, houses lining streets with trees are going to have less demand on air conditioners if they've gone down that road, or not literally down that road, but down that route of tackling it. Then they're going to have less demand on air conditioning than trees, streets that don't have any trees. So trees have a big effect. They don't just cool the shade, they don't just cool the area underneath the tree itself, but they can have an area-wide effect. And studies to show that with urban parks and botanical gardens in urban areas and so on, that cooling effect from that shade in the botanical garden or the park extends somewhere out into the surrounding area. Even if you live 100 yards away from an urban park, a couple of streets back, you will still experience some cooling effect from that vegetation in the park. So the cooling is the shading, but also the evaporation of water from the leaves of the plants. Transpiration itself brings about cooling. you'll know that if you lick your finger and blow on it, it feels cool because of the evaporation of the water from your finger. It's the same with foliage and leaves. And as well as the shade that the plants give us at the time the sun's shining, there is also the effect where the shade is stopping or preventing the paving, the concrete, the slabs, the tarmac and so on, prevents that from heating up, and therefore it avoids those hot evenings and nights that you get in cities, where every surface seems to be radiating heat back at you. And you know, this is obviously more important in hot weather, heat waves and so on. But that effect of not heating up the tarmac and the concrete and the asphalt is a big effect on reducing urban warming. And we might think, oh, urban's a bit of a special case. 80-something% of people live in the UK live in cities. You know, we are an urban race in this country. And, you know, the more we can do to manage climate change in cities, the better. The use of shade is a big part of that. So shade in your garden, planting a tree for shade is absolutely going to keep your garden a bit cooler and so on. Staying with softening the impacts, let's move on and have a little look at insects. And insects, we hear a lot of talk about pollinators, don't we? It's great, they're often in the news. They weren't on the news 10 years ago, but they are now. So that's fine. And, you know, we like insects in a way, don't we? We sort of like insects. And I think the thing is about, you know, it gets a little bit taken out of proportion. I think the real point of doing stuff for insects is not because we love insects. You know, we like butterflies and bees, obviously, they're lovely to see, but the rest of them are a bit like, okay, so there they are. And the other little things as well, the millipedes and the centipedes. The point of creating a good environment for all those little animals, mini beasties, you know, if you want to look at it like that, is that they are the bottom of the food chain, pretty much. And if we get things right for them, then that will filter up the food chain. If we've got stuff right for all the little bugs and creepy crawlies in your garden, we're giving food for the larger things, the frogs and the toads and the newts and the robins and the blackbirds and so on. And they in turn are being food for the sparrowhawks in the food chain. By feeding good stuff in at the bottom, we're making that food chain more sustainable. We're supporting all the little animals above. You might think that by having a nice plant in your garden, it doesn't really affect the blackbirds or the sparrowhawks. You know, we see sparrowhawks over Cambridge quite regularly, even peregrines, of course, that nest wherever they are, in the library or somewhere. So, but we are, by having the right plants in our garden. So coming back to the flowers, there are a lot of honey bred plants, flowers that look like this, that are inaccessible to insects. You know, bees and butterflies and moths and flies and so on aren't able to access the nectar and the pollen from those, whereas the rose at the top with a more open structure is much more accessible. The bees and the flies and so on can easily access the pollen and the nectar from that. I'm not saying don't grow this one at the bottom. If you like this type of rose, then that's lovely. But I'd say also think about having some plants in your garden that are more accessible to insects. But it's not just about the accessibility of the nectar and the pollen. You might want to think about having plants, growing plants, that a range of plants that are in bloom right throughout the year, from the crocuses first thing in the spring. Many of our bumblebees will hibernate as the adult bumblebee, and they will wake up in the spring and they're hungry for nectar and pollen. They need to replenish they need a square meal basically. So crocuses will do that for them, as will other aconites, those spring flowering plants. And then right through to the autumn, again, those insects that hibernate, like we said, like bees, need a good food supply in the autumn, through the summer as well, but into the autumn, in order so they've got good reserves to see them through the winter. And the verbena is a classic example of that, still in bloom but coming to an end. Asters would be another one at this time of year. The Michaelmas daisies, of course, are lovely for the bees and the butterflies. And I haven't mentioned wildflowers as well. Those are, of course, very important. I was thinking more of structured gardens. The wildflower that's really doing very, very well at the moment for insects is ivy. I don't know if you've looked at the flowering ivy in the last week or two. It is alive with insects. There's more insects, I would say, on the flowering ivy than any other plant that we get in our garden. You know, there's bees, there's wasps, there's butterflies, there's all sorts of things going on in there. There's a special bee, you may not have seen it or noticed it. It looks like a honey bee, but it's got quite a stripy abdomen. It's called the ivy bee. And now it's a recent arrival in the UK, and it turned up here maybe 10, 12 years ago, spread really rapidly. It's a sort of climate change refugee. It's native to central, southern Europe, but it's appeared, it's sort of moved northwards like many animals are. They're moving polewards in order to escape, you know, more severe climate change further south. So the ivy bee that you may see on your ivy flowers, I saw one just yesterday on our ivy flowers. It's like a honey bee, but quite a stripy abdomen. Anyway, so there we go. Choose your flowers to suit the insects. You know, you're doing that in order to drive the food chain. But what else can we do? That's really just about food. The flowers are talking about food, but wildlife also needs habitat, doesn't it? It's not just, we're not just giving them some food on the plate. They need somewhere to live. They need a home. And what is the biggest proportion of UK gardens? It's the lawn. You know, if we look at gardens across the UK, there's more lawn space, mown lawn, than there is flower beds or vegetables and so on put together. And you'll probably have heard of No Mow May, and it's been around a few years now. The charity Plant Life dreamt up this idea of No Mow May. Don't mow your lawn for May. They said stop it at the end of April, stop mowing, then mow it at the end of May, which is kind of nice, but really what it ended up doing was your lawn gets populated by all sorts of wildlife over May, and then you come and slash it all down at the end of May. We've now realised, and many people do this, it's better to leave it long for the whole summer. You know, that's much, much better for wildlife. You'll get the bees. This is a pyramid orchid that's appeared in our lawn only since we stopped mowing it in the last few years. We've got pyramid orchids, brown argus, butterflies, love the long grass. We have those in our lawn as well. So undoubtedly it will improve biodiversity, and also staying with climate change. And you might wonder a little bit why I'm talking about biodiversity when we really were talking about climate change. Climate change is one of the factors that's hitting biodiversity and wildlife abundance. There's a variety of other factors as well. You hear stuff about pesticides and the rest of it. But climate change is one of the factors that's driving down the diversity of wildlife that we have in this country. So we're dealing with it in this morning's little talk. Long lawns with plants that have deeper roots than your typical lawn grass. Those deeper roots will push carbon back into the soil. The photosynthesis of those plants in your long lawn is pulling carbon out the air. That's what photosynthesis does. And it's pushed into the plant tissues, including the roots. So, and if you've got deep-rooted plants, that carbon ends up deeper in the soil, and we're pulling carbon out the air and back into the soil where it belongs. Of course, if you are going to grow your lawn long, I don't know if you've come across this or seen it or talked about it, but there can be, I won't say pushback, but some people prefer to see a tidy garden, especially if you do it in your front garden. You know, there may be some people who say, oh dear, what's going on at number 27? You know, has somebody passed away, or is the lawnmower broken, or whatever it is. Last weekend, I mean, in our little climate change gardening thing, this is our table over here, by the way, come and have a look at it afterwards. We did a big plant event last weekend, and we talked with lots of people, hundreds of people, in fact, over the 2 days. It was great. The number of people who said, yeah, you know, I let the grass in my front garden grow long, but people said things about it, and you know, in the new estate where we live, we want to let the grass grow long on our side of the road, where there's several of us who like long grass, but the people on the other side have complained. There is a tension around letting your lawn grow long from people who prefer to see a tidy garden. We could do more about that, you know, but perhaps, you know, one way to show the reason why you're doing it is to show intent. This isn't just neglect. We haven't just like broken the lawnmower and given up. You know, we put a path through it. So, you know, put a border around the edge, a mown border around the edge. Show that this is a managed area and this is deliberate policy on your part, if you like, not simply neglect. Some people have a little sign saying, I'm leaving my lawn long for the bees, or something like that. That's fine. If that works well with you, then that's great as well. But leaving your lawn to grow long is the biggest bit of most gardens. Can have a big impact on, you know, plant and insect. Diversity. There's other things we can do in our garden as well to improve the biodiversity. Of course, a pond folk will say that that's the single biggest thing you can do to your garden to improve biodiversity is put a pond in there. I don't know if you watch, what's his name on the telly last night, Gardener's World, isn't it? On Friday night, Gardener's World on the telly, if you're, you know, if you haven't got anything better to do, it's all right. And,
no.
So I watch it. I watch it. Friday evenings, about all I'm fit for is an hour in front of the telly. And you know, he said on the programme last night, he said, a pond is the best way to improve biodiversity in your garden. And his pond was lovely, wasn't it? It was covered in weeds and you could barely see the water. There's all sorts going on in it. He wanted to tidy it up, and that's okay.
Can I just ask,
yeah,
our pond's gone almost 3/4 of it's gone with tiny little green things I think are growing in that photo. How should we get rid of those? Are those good for our
they don't really do any harm, but also if you've got too many and you're unhappy with it, it's easy to skin them off. Just you need a fishing net. If you go to, I mean, I'm kind of loath to promote garden centres by name, but there's one in Shelford, quite a big one.
I've got a kids one.
You've got a kids net. That's fine. If you can reach all your pond with your kids net, then that's great. Fish it off, and you know there won't be much wildlife tied up in it. If you're getting weeds from underneath, we talk about, oh, what about the newt tangled up in the weed? How do we set it free? But that stuff you can always just skim off the top with your child's fishing net. You might put it in a washing up bowl to make sure you haven't caught a newt or a beautiful water beetle. If you have, chuck it back in the pond, and the rest of it can go in the compost heap. It'll come again next year, you know, without doubt. It's called duckweed. We get ducks on our pond sometimes, and they absolutely eat it. They will eat all of it. It's extraordinary. You know, you'll get to the situation where it's covered in that duckweed, and I'm thinking I need to get my net out. The next weekend there'll be 2 ducks on the pond, because maybe in the spring, and they just eat all of it. It just goes. They love it. Anyway, so the pond is there, and the pond, as you know, supports all that aquatic wildlife, the frogs and toads, the dragonflies that, you know, crawled up the stem, the adults have emerged from there. But, you know, and you might think, well, I'm not a great fan of toads and, you know, things that fly around, you know, dragonflies and so on. But a garden pond is also going to support terrestrial wildlife as well. So, you know, you may not think, oh, you put in a pond for the hedgehogs, but absolutely a pond is going to help the hedgehogs. You know, hedgehogs, like every other animal, need to drink, and they need to drink every day. And if in your neighbourhood, you know, there's not many ponds, the hedgehog, the poor old hedgehog is going to have to walk this way and that way and cross the road and walk down the pavement to find a garden with a pond. If you've got a garden, if you've got a pond in your garden, that's an extra watering hole for those hedgehogs. They won't have to walk so far. But it's not just hedgehogs, of course. This is a wasp, again, maybe not your favourite insect. It's just a picture I took of a, you know, wasp having a drink on a bowl with some water in it in a garden 2 or 3 weeks ago. Bees need to drink. You know, most animals need to drink on a regular basis. And if we get a prolonged hot, dry spell, all that, you know, like we do often in July, let's say, or August, or even June, all that casual water dries up. The ditches and wet bits and all that, those are all dry. And pretty much the only water that exists would be in big lakes, you know, like the botanical garden, for example, or in your garden. So ponds can have a big effect on supporting not only aquatic life, also the terrestrial life as well, the insects and the hedgehogs and weasels or whatever you've got where you are. So there's a tendency, isn't there, to think, well, I'm doing my bit in my garden. Here's a photograph of, well, let's call it Cherry Hinton. Doesn't really matter where it is. It's some houses with gardens there. And here's you. Look, you've got, you decided to, you know, go a bit climate change sort of wilding thing in your garden, and that's lovely. So it's all gone quite green, and there's a pond in there. But it's a bit of an isolated oasis. You know, that's lovely that you're doing it, but you know, and then fortunately, your next door neighbours look over the fence and you have a chat with them, and you remember this thing about actually most people are concerned about climate change. It's not just you. Like there's a tendency for us to think most people are concerned about climate change. So you talk with them about the benefits of letting the lawn grow long or putting some extra plants in, and they've done the same thing. So that's great. Now there's 2 of you, And then they talk with the people who they go to the pub with on a Friday, and they said, fantastic, we'll have a go at that. And then this lot, they meet them at the school gates, sometimes collecting the children, and they said, yeah, we're going to let our bottom bit of our lawn grow long, and that'll help the butterflies. And then they talk with them, because actually they work at the same place. And so it goes on, and before long, you've got this sort of mosaic of no longer are you the sort of lonely voice in the wilderness with your one isolated garden. Through your efforts and through your example and through your I'm growing my lawn long for the bees thing in your front garden, suddenly you've got a whole bunch of people with this all joined up. And the more that we can join up bits of green habitat like this, the more resilient the wildlife population becomes. You know, even if their pond develops a leak and, you know, all the little animals die out, sadly, that can happen. But never mind, when they get a new one, you know, the dragonflies and the rest of it, the newts can crawl across from the other places nearby, and it all gets back to normal again. It becomes a more resilient population. It can take some damage and some knocks and recover from it. And this is very much a thinking now with sort of urban planning on a sort of you know, local authority level, but also at an individual level. You know, you can do your bit here, and this changes the way we think about our gardens. You know, we tend to think of our gardens as our own space. Here's our house, we've got a living room. Our living room is absolutely ours. We sit there, we've got the telly, there's the children, whatever. This is our place. And the garden really is just the outdoor extension of that. This is our garden. We plant whatever flowers we like. We sit there, and the children, the grandchildren, whatever's come and play around, and it's all lovely. That's our bit. We've got a fence around it and a hedge. Actually, from the point of view of wildlife, that's not the way they look at your garden. They see that as part of a connected sort of landscape. And arguably, when you're thinking about what to do in your garden in terms of planting for wildlife and planting for climate change, think about the broader landscape. You know, does your broader landscape need an extra pond to back up the one that's next door but one? You know, would it be more beneficial for you to leave your lawn grow long? Because let's say the verge is there, the council is leaving the verges grow long, which is nice, but if your bit is long as well, then if the verge does get mown, then you've still got your bit left to balance it out. So you can see your garden in some ways as your own private space, but also in terms of wildlife, a much more connected space and benefiting the whole community of animals and so on that live there. Okay, well, we've had a look at accept and adapt, didn't we? We said accept and adapt, that we're going to put in a Mediterranean garden. We talked about softening the impact. We've said that climate change can be very damaging to wildlife, and therefore we'll do this X, Y, and Z to our garden. But let's move on. Let's say that we're a bit worried about our carbon dioxide emissions. You know, we know there's quite a lot coming out. So here we go. Here's number 32 down the road here. This is their front garden. What do we think of that? Well, it's got a lot of paving. There are some, I'm not sure if those are plastic plants or real ones. We did have to deliver some leaflets for a lot of houses a while ago, and there were some front gardens that were kind of like this, and there was a row of plants, and you thought, that's good. But when you got to the door to put the leaflet in, oh, the plants were plastic, and you realise the whole thing was, but anyway, there's a lot of them around. There's one very, very close to here, actually. I walked past it just the other day, 200 yards from here, I'm going to say. But anyway, that's fine. People have got to plant their cars somewhere. But what do we think about paving? Well, the manufacture of bricks and cement is very, very carbon intensive. It takes a lot of energy to the manufacturing process of cement and the manufacturing process of bricks. 8% of the world's CO2 emissions come from that industry. So the less bricks and cement we use, the better it is for climate change. And I know we've got to live in a house that's made of bricks and cement probably, but we don't have to put it all over our garden. So yeah, think twice about hard paving all over your garden. And while I'm having a little bit of a hard paving rant, I'll also mention, as we've said before, that hard paving will soak up the sun on hot days, especially when it's completely exposed to the sun like this, and radiate it out in the evening and the night, leading to those hot nights in the city. So it becomes a sort of a radiator, really, that keeps the city hot. Of course, it sheds water when we've got heavy rain, and that water can lead to flash flooding down the road. I know they've got some drains here, but the chances are that is not going to soak up all the water that comes off there when we get one of these increasingly heavy summer downpours that we talked about earlier. And of course, also one of the things we should be thinking about, ideally in our garden, is capturing carbon dioxide from the air by using plants. And there's 5 plants, or is that six plants there? But we're losing an opportunity there to capture carbon dioxide. So if we're thinking about our front garden and we've got a car, we want some off-road parking, and that's okay. I'm not going to start on cars and electric cars and public transport, but if we did want to do that, then at least minimise the new paving that we're going to put down. And if we are going to put paving down, then use permeable materials that let the water soak through. And you can get permeable ones on which grass will grow as well. So it's like semi-hard. You can park your car on there, but there will still be some grass growing between the gravel and those little compartments. So there's ways through that. The RHS has got a good publication called Greening Grey Britain, which is all about dealing with your front garden and trying to green it up a bit. We at last weekend's event with our stand, we had 2 people, didn't we? There was one lady came up and said, we bought this house, and they had a massive terrace. She said in the first year it was just so hot we couldn't go out there. And so she said, I've dug up 3/4 of it and thrown the slabs away, turned it to garden. And I said, it's lovely now, it's much, much cooler, and we had a nice time out there, and that's great. And there was another lady, wasn't there? She bought a house, and she said the thing was about her house, when you looked on Google Earth, it showed the whole garden as paved, and the whole lot from top to bottom. It was the only garden that was like that. And anyway, so she ripped up the slabs, hadn't she? But she said Google Earth hasn't been round with their satellite again since, and it still shows it was all paved. She was like waiting for the time when her garden on Google Earth would appear as green, like everybody else's. So yeah, de-paving is a thing. I don't know if you've heard of de-paving. Some London local authorities have de-paving programs that encourage people to take out as much of that stuff as they can, especially in their front gardens.
In Europe, let's say in Germany, when you have pavement like this,
yeah,
that's water through. You have to pay for it.
You have to pay for it.
Yes,
great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, the seal that we have to pay for that. That is for over a decade.
Fantastic. Great stuff. Oh, brilliant. You heard that. Yeah, in Germany, you've got to pay to pave over your front garden. Good news. There is, I know the Netherlands is also very keen on this. I came across online when I was working on this deep paving thing. In the Netherlands, I came across a deep paving ramp. One of the local authorities commissioned a rap band to produce a deep. I couldn't understand it because it was in, but the idea was great. I thought. Anyway, so reducing our CO2 emissions and other stuff as well by deep paving. Growing your own food, of course. There are very hefty quantities of CO2 embodied in much of the food we eat. If you're buying green beans from Kenya or tomatoes from wherever, Morocco or Senegal or somewhere, there will be a lot of carbon dioxide involved in the, not so much in the growth, but to some extent in the growth of them, but in the shipment, refrigerated shipment of green beans from Kenya, for example, or even from Botswana. Recently in our local supermarket, there are green beans there from Botswana, which is basically southern Africa.
I thought that was a bit debunked, because like on a global level, it's still sort of more efficient to do that if you are trying to feed a population. And actually, if you're just looking at your garden, the time spent maybe driving to the garden center, maybe buying the seeds, and that versus feeding a whole community with the produce that has been brought. But I think maybe yes, a smaller carbon footprint, but I think it's that connection with the garden, and you see the process of growing a vegetable, and that can make you a bit more aware of what happens in the process.
That's very true. That's very true. Yeah, that connection with your food and the production of the food is important. But coming back to that debunking thing, I don't know if you're referring to it, but there was a study published, I'm going to say earlier this year, maybe in the spring this year, which was widely reported in the national press. And it said, oh, in supermarket grown food is more carbon efficient or less, carbon than home-grown food. And this is widely covered in some of the newspapers, most of the newspapers saying, oh, it's more, shop-bought food is a smaller carbon footprint. the reason their study came to that conclusion was because in their study, they factored in, for the homegrown food, they factored in a lot of infrastructure in your garden. They said, we've got to include you laying a concrete path down your garden to get to the end.
So again, it's kind of a battle of the math. So sometimes it's, of course, you need to understand how the study was run.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I'm not a carbon economist, I'll say that right now. But when I looked at the issues that were included in their calculation for homegrown food, I thought, well, it's not that they're irrelevant, but they included the concrete for the path in the garden over, like, they factored it in over a 5-year period.
Yeah, it's like basically starting from scratch.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
If you were to start from scratch to grow your food versus the green bean that gets shipped, how much would you spend on putting that infrastructure in place in the first place?
My feeling was the study was misleading, but I mean, you're right, there are efficiencies at scale in commercial food production. And food that is, which supermarket you go to, the supermarket we tend to go to because it's nearest, has on the bag where the stuff's grown. So, you know, we can get green beans, it says they're grown in Suffolk, you know, there's potatoes grown in Essex and so on. So, you know, I dare say with the sort of efficiency of scale, I'm not going to grow green beans more, but I like growing green beans, so I do it anyway. And the same would apply to flowers as well. And I know not everybody grows food in their garden, it's not for everyone, but some people just prefer to grow flowers, and that's fine. And homegrown flowers, again, with your qualification, are going to be more carbon efficient than Kenyan you know, plants that are flown in and you buy them at the petrol station because you're going to somebody's for dinner and you've got to take something. So homegrown stuff in general, but as you say, there's a question of carbon accounting in there, as there is with all this stuff. And I didn't really want to dig into that detail, but you're absolutely right to raise it.
I know. I mean, I'm all for growing your vegetables. I think it's just people get to sort of despair. You know, it's like, oh my gosh, I've grown 3 radishes, and in the supermarket I can buy them for 50p. What's the value in what I'm doing? I think it's more, again, connecting you with the nature, with the process, and understanding that probably you're not going to sustain yourself for a whole year from the tiny allotment that you have, but it makes you more aware.
Some groups we talk to have got a lot of allotment people in there. I don't know if anybody here has got an allotment. And so there's some allotment people as well. So they're moving, you're moving, you know, hopefully more in keeping, you know, more months of food supply going. Anyway, moving on, carbon dioxide emissions. You know, I was, I would say, brought up to dig the soil, but digging the soil in the vegetable patch and to some extent in the flower bed when it was needed was absolutely part of digging. Now we realise that whenever we turn soil over, the carbon that's in the soil, much of it is oxidised off as carbon dioxide and goes off into the air. And the UK Environment Agency estimate that about half, or in many areas of the UK, half of the carbon that was originally locked up in British soils has been released to the atmosphere through, largely of course through agriculture, but also through urbanisation and gardening and so on. Those also play a part in it. So massive quantities of carbon have been liberated, or maybe not the right word, released anyway, from soils and oxidised off into carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So on our part, you know, no dig, which was, I suppose, formerly a kind of bit of a fringe topic. It was like, oh, you can do no dig if you want. It wasn't exactly hippie-ish, but it was like a kind of thing out there on the edge of gardening. Now it's moved much more mainstream. You know, people have realised that no dig gardening, you know, as well as keeping the weeds down and all those practical issues, also helps keep carbon in the ground and helps indeed put more carbon in the ground. And you know, I was kind of sceptical about no dig. We started it this year in earnest, and I've been amazed how successful it's been. It's just the first year, but in terms of not needing to water the plants because the mulch traps the water in and so on. You know, part of our vegetable area is no dig, part of it isn't, and the no dig area has done so well this year. So that's turned me over it. So keeping carbon in the soil through avoiding digging is important. And then finally, I can't remember when we started, but anyway, we're almost done. Are we all right, Fran?
Yeah,
we're good, yeah. And so the final little section You know, we've talked about accepting and adapting. It's saying, okay, climate change is coming. How can I have a nice garden? And then we moved on to softening the impact, you know, things that I can do that stop things getting too bad, like digging a pond for some wildlife. And then, you know, we moved on to reducing our carbon dioxide emissions. I could have talked about not having a petrol lawnmower, but we didn't get onto that, and that's fine. Finally, we're going to talk about carbon capture. You know, I'm sure you'll know enough about climate change to realise there's more carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere than there should be, and unless that level is brought down, then you know, we're going to carry on with this climate change issue. And if the level goes up even further, of course, it's going to get worse. And I'm not going to get involved in that. But carbon capture. So what can we do with our average of 188 square metres of garden that will improve carbon capture? Well, coming back to that digging thing, undisturbed soil normally contains vast, you know, looking at, you know, the country as a whole, contains billions of tonnes of carbon. Half of it has been lost through agriculture and urbanisation. And we don't have to increase the carbon in the soil very much in percentage terms to make a great big difference. That the French government, in one of the recent COPs, tried to introduce or tried to reach a national agreement in adapting agriculture to trap more carbon in the soil. They have this figure, well, I think it's widely recognised now, that if we could increase the carbon in the soil by 0.4% per year, that is, you know, roughly enough to compensate for most global emissions of carbon dioxide. Because soil is everywhere and it's so heavy, 0.4% of the soil actually ends up with zillions of tonnes. And in France, they are trying to tweak their agriculture to keep carbon in the soil by not doing so much deep ploughing, by having green cover at times when the soil would otherwise be bare, and so on. So what can we do as gardeners? We're not farmers in France. We're not being told what to do by the French Department of Agriculture. So what can we do? Well, move away from annual plants, you know, move away from petunias and bedding begonias and those sorts of plants, plant more perennials and trees. Because these plants, they're sucking carbon out the air. They are in effect carbon capture devices. Look, here's my carbon capture device. You might have read about carbon capture devices, you know, large industrial places in Iceland trying to do it. Well, this is also a very efficient carbon capture device through the process of photosynthesis. So with our trees and our shrubs, we're sucking carbon out the air. That carbon is either being embodied in the wood of the tree, and over time, trees will, you know, if they're allowed to grow to a medium size, there'll be a large quantity of carbon locked up in the trunk and the branches of that tree, but also the carbon that's in the leaves, which falls off every autumn onto the ground. You know, those leaves are pulled into the soil by the worms, and that carbon ends up back in the soil, and we're putting carbon back where it should be. So perennials and trees, rather than annual plants, will do a lot to pull carbon out of the air. And of course, there's plenty of perennials and trees which are beautiful to look at, that have lovely flowers and so on, just because we're not planting so many petunias or bedding begonias and so on, doesn't mean we're going to have a simply green garden. We can still have lots and lots and lots of colour. So there's the capture carbon that way. On our vegetable patch, for example, you know, if we're in between, we've harvested our summer crops, and we've got bare soil, and we think we'll just leave it bare over the winter, and then we'll put our next plants in the spring. Well, plant cover crops on that bare soil. This is increasingly what they're doing in France, and they're finding they're getting better yield from their summer crops as a result, because the carbon is being kept in the soil. It's not bare soil exposed to the atmosphere, and the nutrients in the soil are not being leached out by the winter rains and so on. It keeps the soil in far better condition by putting a cover crop on it, green manure, if you like. So those will make a big difference to the carbon in the soils. And there's other, sorry. Yeah.
So you put that down. What do you do in the spring with that green stuff? You don't eat it, do you?
No. It's not a food. You can just mow it off, you know, with a mower, for example. It's quite, they're quite tender plants. Some of them will even die off by the end of the winter anyway. So there's mustard and alfalfa and various cover crops that are used. One of the big sort of research drives in France is to look at, you know, the best cover crops for use in different situations. But there's a number of different plants available. But those plants generally will die off by the time you get to the spring or the end of the winter. They'll be dead. If they're not dead, you can mow them off and then put your, whatever it is, your brassicas in, your you know, courgettes, and your tomatoes and your beans and whatever it is you're planting in the spring. So, staying with the carbon capture, finally, you know, what else can we do to improve or increase carbon capture? You know, think of the vertical surfaces as well as the horizontal surfaces. If you've got a fence or a bare wall, put plants up it. You know, those are all sucking carbon out of the air all summer long. And of course, also increasing biodiversity, you know, there'll be, you know, flowers and habitats for birds and other insects and so on in there. So cover our hard surfaces where we can with foliage, and of course, use mulch and compost and so on in our garden. Formerly, we thought we had to dig this in, and I would say more and more, use it, you know, use it as a surface dressing. And a lot of gardeners are doing this now. They're not laboriously digging compost in, but they, you know, they've got their compost and spread it over the soil and just leave it there. And the worms do the work for them. Gradually, it'll disappear. You're putting that nutrition and the carbon, you know, back in the soil, and it saves all that digging the soil that formerly you had to do. So you retain a good soil structure with the little worm tunnels and all the little animals that live in the soil do that work for you. So there's a whole bunch of ideas there. Now, you know, you might be thinking, well, you know, I've only got a small garden. I live in Cambridge or wherever it is. You know, this is all very nice, Clive, what you're telling me, some lovely ideas, but is it frankly going to make any difference? Well, I think the way that we look at this, if you look at the official land use statistics for the UK, private gardens are the third largest land use statistic. The biggest is agriculture, not surprisingly. The second biggest is open land, sort of Dartmoor and Pennines and the rest of that. The third biggest is private gardens. There's almost 2,500 square miles of private gardens in the UK, and which is about twice the area of Cambridgeshire. It's more than all the nature reserves are put together. So it's really quite significant. It's not the biggest, but it still is quite significant. And importantly, there's about 20 odd million gardeners in the UK doing their thing on their 188 square metres out the back. So even small changes in garden practice, multiply that by 25 million, can have quite a big difference. So that's where our climate change gardening thing, that's where we're coming from with that, you know, is, you know, together gardeners, you know, can make a significant difference. There's just a little example I've got here. The RHS talks on one of their pages on the website about the carbon locked up in a bunch of imported flowers. And they say that a bunch of imported flowers, you know, has a carbon footprint, about 8 kilograms of carbon embodied in a bunch of imported flowers from, you know, perhaps Africa or sometimes even the Caribbean. And they're refrigerated, they're grown over there. Of course, they're refrigerated in transit. They're flown over here because they don't have a long shelf life. They're kept in a refrigerated warehouse. They're delivered in a refrigerated truck to the garage or the supermarket. And so, you know, there's maybe 8 kilograms of carbon embodied within those flowers. If we're to grow them ourselves, we save that. I know there's your argument about the concrete down the paths and so on. No. But we're bearing that in mind. We're bearing that in mind.
I came across it.
We're bearing that in mind. 8 kilograms on one bunch of flowers. If only 1 million of these 25 people say, oh, I'm going to grow my own cut flowers from now on. 1 million people with 8 kilograms, you know, that's 8,000 tons of carbon, not, you know, going into imported cut flowers. So, you know, the maths is there on 25 million people and 2,500 square miles. That together, you know, small changes can make a big difference. So, you know, where do you start on this? Because you may have thought, well, Clive, talked about so much stuff, and you know, I'm really not quite sure where we're going to go with this. Well, it's this idea of small, achievable goals. You don't have to do everything all at once. Of course you don't. You know, we're not saying that, but we're saying pick something that, do you know what? You know, it could work in my garden. You know, maybe you're thinking of doing a pond anyway, and it's one of those things you've been on the point of doing for some years, but never got around to it. Well, maybe now's a good time to start that. Or maybe, you know, that is a little bit of work, making a pond, absolutely. But maybe you were thinking of, you know, well, let's replace some of the annual beds with shrubs. Let's put shrubs in there instead. They're going to stay there. We don't have to dig the ground up every year as we do with annual plants. And you know, those plants are going to stay there year after year, and they're going to capture carbon out the air and do their bit. There's a lot of different options you've got. You know, perhaps we're not going to mow the end bit of the lawn. We're going to mow the front bit because we like to sit on there, and the children and the rest of it. But maybe the back bit of the lawn, we can stop mowing that. It doesn't cost you anything. Don't need planning permission. There's not a great lead time on stopping mowing your lawn. So it's an easy win, if you like. I think the point is there's lots of doable things together. You know, Britain's 25 million gardeners can have a positive impact on climate change. Just to say, final minute about ourselves. So we're a little charity, recently got charitable status. We come and give talks to, you know, there we are, top left, giving a talk in West Wickham. We have a stand. This is last weekend. We were down at this big plant event. We talked to several hundred people about their gardens and their lawns and their paving and their wildlife. And had some lovely conversations with them. We're actually privileged to talk with them all. And then we organised a scything demo. For those who let their lawn grow too long, we organised a scything demo. So I know scything's not for everybody, and but it's interesting to see it. And scything is a thing now. There was a scything festival at Wandlebury, I think, last year. They had a scything festival. It's become a thing.
It was this year.
This year, was it?
It was a competition.
Competition. Fantastic. They have folk singers, they drink cider, everybody gets together, children come.
It always has to go in the extreme. It's like
Yeah.
not just teaching you how to side.
It's just a side. It's a side. It's a wooden thing with a blade on the end. Anyway, there's folk music and everything on cider tied up. It's all good.
Yes.
Anyway, that's us. Look,